Winter 1939-1940 Finland had been fighting for its very existence for just over a month. The Soviet Union had invaded the country on November 30th, 1939, and Red Army forces had crossed the border at numerous points along a front stretching for more than 1,000 kilometers. Far from the major battles of the Karelian Isthmus, however, one of the most famous military engagements of the entire Winter War was developing in the forests of Kainuu. Its setting was a narrow, snow-covered forest road near the Soviet border, the Raate Road. The Soviet offensive in the Suomussalmi sector posed a serious threat. Red Army forces had advanced deep into Finnish territory, and their direction of advance led westward. By the end of December, Finnish forces had succeeded in forcing the Soviet 163rd Division, which had been fighting in the area of Suomussalmi village, to retreat. But the battle was not over. Another large Soviet formation was already approaching from the east. The 44th Division had advanced westward along the Raate Road with the intention of supporting the Soviet forces fighting in the Suomussalmi area. At the beginning of January 1940, the division had a strength of approximately 14,000 men. Facing it was a considerably smaller Finnish force. The Finnish troops were commanded by Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo. His forces could not rely on superior numbers, tanks, or massive artillery support. Instead, their strengths were mobility, knowledge of the terrain, the ability to operate effectively in winter conditions, and the capability to move on skis through forests and deep snow where heavy equipment dependent on roads could not advance. At the same time, the Raate Road represented both a vital lifeline and a dangerous bottleneck for the Soviet forces. The long division, together with its equipment, vehicles, artillery, and supply units, was forced to operate around a narrow road surrounded by snow-covered forests. The Finns intended to exploit this vulnerability. Their objective was to cut the road at several points, divide the enemy formation into isolated sections, and prevent those sections from supporting one another. What followed was a battle whose events have, over the decades, become part of Finnish military legend. But myths have also developed around that legend. Very different figures and accounts have been presented regarding the actual strength of the 44th Division, its casualties, and even the course of some events. Later Finnish research, together with studies based on Russian archival material, has provided a more precise picture of what actually happened on the Raate Road. In this documentary, we will not simply repeat the legend, we will follow the events day by day and, whenever the surviving evidence allows it, hour by hour. We will examine the actions of the Finnish forces, the fate of the Soviet 44th Division, the decisive moments of the battle, and the decisions that ultimately determined its outcome. We will use Finnish war diaries, archival material, photographs, and later military historical research, while comparing them with available Soviet material. The purpose is neither to reinforce the legend nor to tear it down for its own sake. The purpose is to determine, as accurately as possible, what actually happened. This is a story of freezing cold, darkness, forests, and war. A story of thousands of Finnish and Soviet soldiers who, in January 1940, found themselves fighting in one of the most unforgiving environments of the Winter War, and above all, this is the story of one of the most famous battles in Finnish military history, the Battle of Raate Road. The Battle of Raate Road cannot be understood by looking only at the events of January 1940. Behind it was a much larger military plan that had been prepared before the first shots of the Winter War were fired. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army did not concentrate its operations solely on the Karelian Isthmus. Soviet forces also attacked along the more northern sections of Finland's long eastern border, where roads were scarce, distances were vast, and winter conditions were extremely difficult. One of these directions of attack ran through Suomussalmi. Suomussalmi was located far from Finland's most important cities and industrial centers, but militarily the area had considerably greater importance than a quick look at a map might suggest road connections. led westward from Suomussalmi toward Salmi and onward toward the transportation network of Ostrobothnia. If the Soviet offensive succeeded, Red Army forces could have continued their advance toward the direction of Oulu. For Finland, this represented a serious strategic threat. Oulu was an important port and transportation center, and connections to Sweden ran through northern Finland. A deep Soviet advance across Finland's narrow central region could have seriously disrupted the country's internal communications and the defense of northern Finland. Later, accounts have often summarized the Soviet objective as an attempt to cut Finland in two at the latitude of Oulu. The actual military planning, however, was more complicated than this simple expression suggests. In any case, the forces operating in the Suomussalmi sector were intended to advance deep into Finnish territory toward the west. The offensive was assigned to the Red Army's 9th Army. Its forces were required to operate across an enormous area extending from north of Lake Ladoga far into the north. In the Suomussalmi sector, the 163rd Rifle Division became the principal formation of the offensive. On the morning of November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border in the Suomussalmi area as well. The Finnish border troops were too few in number to stop the offensive at the frontier. Their task was to delay the enemy, destroy communications and infrastructure that could be used by the advancing forces whenever possible, and gradually withdraw westward. Already at this stage, a problem emerged that would later have a decisive influence on the battles of both Suomussalmi and the Raate Road. The roads. There was no dense road network in the wilderness of Kainuu. Vast forests, lakes, and marshes dominated the landscape. In winter, they were covered by snow and ice. Soviet heavy equipment, trucks, artillery, and supply services were heavily dependent on the few roads that were available. For the Finns, the same environment offered very different possibilities. Finnish soldiers were able to move on skis through the forests away from the roads. This allowed units to move against the enemy's flanks and rear in ways that large Soviet formations tied to the roads could not easily counter. During the first days of the war, however, this advantage did not mean that the Finns controlled the situation. Quite the opposite. The Soviet 163rd Division continued to advance. Finnish forces fought delaying actions and withdrew ahead of the attackers. The Soviet advance continued toward the village of Suomussalmi. During the first days of December, the situation began to look increasingly dangerous for the Finns. If the offensive could not be stopped, the Red Army could continue westward. The Finnish command was forced to send additional troops into the area. With these reinforcements, Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo emerged as the central Finnish commander in the battles around Suomussalmi. The forces under his command first had to stop the offensive of the 163rd Division. Only after that could the Finns begin to think about defeating the enemy. But while the battle for Suomussalmi was intensifying, another movement was already underway on the Soviet side. The 163rd Division needed assistance. From the east, toward the Finnish border and the Raate Road, another Soviet division was approaching, the 44th Division. Its arrival would change the situation once again, and the fate of this division would become inseparably connected, with a name that would later become known throughout Finland, the Raate Road. During the first days of December 1939, the situation of the Finnish defenders at Suomussalmi rapidly became increasingly difficult. The Soviet 163rd Division continued its advance into Finnish territory. Its forces did not approach Suomussalmi along only one route, but instead operated across a wide area. The small Finnish covering forces attempted to delay the advance, but they were unable to establish a defensive line strong enough to stop an entire division. The Finns were forced to retreat. At the same time, they attempted to prevent the enemy from making use of the area's buildings, roads, and other infrastructure. In the winter wilderness, this was extremely important. Buildings provided shelter from the freezing temperatures, while usable roads were essential for Soviet supply operations and heavy equipment. The fate of Suomussalmi village became a dramatic example of this. when the Finns realized that they would not be able to hold the village. A large part of its buildings was burned before the withdrawal. The purpose was to prevent the Red Army from obtaining warm accommodation for its troops. On December 7th, Soviet forces captured Suomussalmi village. The situation appeared serious. Only 1 week after the beginning of the war, the Red Army had advanced deep into Finnish territory and taken control of the central settlement of Suomussalmi. But the advance was also beginning to create new problems. The farther the Soviet 163rd Division moved from the border, the longer its supply lines became. Food, ammunition, fuel, and other supplies had to be carried with the troops or transported behind them along the few available roads. For the Finns, this created an opportunity. If the Soviet supply routes could be cut, the position of the advancing division could rapidly become difficult. But first, the Finns needed more men. The Finnish High Command reacted to the dangerous situation at Suomussalmi by sending reinforcements into the area. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo now assumed a central role. Siilasvuo was a Finnish Jaeger who had received military training in Germany during the First World War and had become an experienced Finnish officer. His task was now to command the forces that had to stop the Soviet advance in the Suomussalmi sector. The situation, however, was not simple. Moving Siilasvuo's forces into the area took time. The first transport arrived at Salmi on December 9th. 1 day late after the transport had been involved in an accident with a freight train during the journey. The troops had to be brought into battle. Quickly, the Finns could not afford to wait for long. The Soviet 163rd Division was already at Suomussalmi, and every additional day gave it an opportunity to strengthen its positions and continue its advance. The first objective of the forces under Siilasvuo became stopping the offensive and threatening the enemy's supply connections. On December 11th, the Finns launched a major counteroffensive in the area of Suomussalmi village. The attack began in the morning. At the same time, the Finns attempted to strike into the rear of the Soviet forces and cut the Raate Road, which formed one of the 163rd Division's important connections to the east. This was of decisive importance. The Finns were not simply attempting to push the Red Army backward through a direct frontal assault. They were attempting to strike at the point upon which a large Soviet formation was most dependent: its supply system. The forests gave the Finns opportunities to move around the enemy positions. Troops moving on skis could use routes that a Soviet division operating with heavy equipment and motor vehicles could not exploit in the same way. The fighting around Suomussalmi, however, continued for weeks. The 163rd Division did not collapse as the result of a single attack. Soviet troops defended themselves, launched counterattacks, and attempted to hold the positions they had captured. The Finns, meanwhile, constantly had to move their forces through difficult terrain formed by forests, lakes, and roads. During the middle of December and the weeks that followed, exhausting battles were fought around Suomussalmi during some of the coldest and darkest weeks of the winter. But gradually, the situation that had existed during the first days of the war began to change. At the end of November and the beginning of December, the Finns had been forced to retreat. Now the initiative was beginning to pass to them. The communications of the 163rd Division were under threat, and its position in the Suomussalmi area was becoming more difficult with each passing day. The Soviet command understood that the forces fighting at Suomussalmi needed reinforcements. A new division was ordered to their assistance. This was not yet the beginning of the Battle of Raate Road itself, but it was the moment when events began to lead inevitably toward it. From the east, the Soviet 44th Division was approaching. Its mission was to assist the 163rd Division and restore the Soviet initiative in the Suomussalmi sector. Ahead of it, however, there was only one proper road along which the men, vehicles, artillery, and supplies of a large division could advance toward Suomussalmi, the Raate Road. As December 1939 progressed, the situation at Suomussalmi became increasingly difficult for the Soviet forces. The 163rd Division had succeeded in advancing deep into Finnish territory and capturing Suomussalmi village. but Finnish resistance had grown stronger. The arrival of forces commanded by Hjalmar Siilasvuo had changed the balance, and the Soviet division's supply connections were coming under increasing pressure. The command of the Soviet Ninth Army needed a solution. More strength had to be brought into the Suomussalmi sector. The 44th Division, commanded by Brigade Commander Alexei Vinogradov, was assigned to the task. The division was a Ukrainian formation in the sense that its peacetime station and a large part of its personnel were from Ukraine. It should not, however, be described as a separate Ukrainian army. It was part of the Soviet Red Army and operated within the Red Army's command structure. The 44th Division would later become one of the best-known military formations associated with the history of the Raate Road. At the same time, one of the battle's most persistent myths developed around it. For decades, many Finnish accounts describe the division as having approximately 17,000, 20,000, or even 25,000 men. Soviet documents that later became available have considerably clarified the picture. Around the turn of 1939 to 1940, the strength of the 44th Division was approximately 14,000 men. Based on Soviet records, a figure of 13,962 men has been given for its strength at the beginning of January. It was still a large force, but it was not a division of 25,000 men. This distinction matters, because even during the war, the events of the Raate Road developed into a story of an almost unimaginable victory by a small Finnish force against an enormous enemy army. The reality was dramatic enough without exaggerating the numbers. In addition to its infantry, the 44th Division had artillery, vehicles, tractors, and other heavy equipment. It also carried a vast amount of material required to supply the formation. On paper, it represented a considerable military force. In the forests of Kainuu, however, that force had to operate in an environment poorly suited to a large motorized formation. The division had to advance toward Suomussalmi along the Raate Road. The road ran from the vicinity of the Soviet border westward toward Suomussalmi. Around it stretched forests, marshes, and lakes. Even during summer, the road network in the region was sparse. In winter, the problems became greater. Deep snow made it difficult for vehicles to move away from the road. Artillery pieces, trucks, and other heavy equipment were effectively dependent on it. When thousands of men and large quantities of equipment were placed along the same narrow route, the division's formation stretched into a long column. This would later become crucial. For the Finns, the Raate Road was not simply the enemy's route of advance, it was a target. If the road could be cut at several points, the different sections of the division could be separated from one another. A large force would then no longer be able to use its full strength as a single unified formation. But in December 1939, this outcome was not yet predetermined. The mission of the 44th Division was clear. It was to advance westward and assist the 163rd Division, which was in increasing difficulty in the Suomussalmi area. Time was important. The position of the 163rd Division was steadily deteriorating. Finnish pressure was increasing. Supply connections were threatened, and the troops had to fight in severe winter conditions. The advance of the 44th Division, however, did not take place quickly enough to resolve the situation. Its troops and equipment accumulated along the Raate Road while the fighting around Suomussalmi continued. At the end of December, a decisive turning point occurred. The Finns increased their pressure against the 163rd Division. On December 27th, Finnish forces launched their decisive attack in the area of Suomussalmi village. The Soviet position broke. The main elements of the 163rd Division began withdrawing eastward across Lake Kiantajärvi. The Finns had achieved a major victory, but Siilasvuo was given little time to rest. Another Soviet division remained east of his forces. The 44th Division had not disappeared. It was on the Raate Road. Thousands of soldiers, artillery pieces, trucks, horses, and other equipment were spread along the snow-covered forest road. After the withdrawal of the 163rd Division, The original mission of the 44th Division had effectively lost its purpose. It had come to assist a force that was already retreating. Now the Finns could turn their attention toward it. Siilasvuo's forces had been fighting for weeks. The men were exhausted. The temperatures were severe, yet the Finns now had a rare opportunity. In front of them stood a large enemy division whose movement was restricted by a single narrow road. If the road could be cut, and the division divided into isolated sections, the importance of its superiority in manpower and equipment could be drastically reduced. The Battle of Suomussalmi had turned in Finland's favor, but the next battle was only beginning. Its battlefield would not be a town or a continuous defensive line. Its battlefield would be a narrow road running through the forests of Kainuu, the Raate Road. During the final days of December 1939, the situation on the Suomussalmi battlefield had changed fundamentally. The main elements of the Soviet 163rd Division had withdrawn eastward from the area of Suomussalmi village. The Finns had achieved a major victory. But Hjalmar Siilasvuo knew that the fighting in the region was not over. The Soviet 44th Division was still on the Raate Road. It represented a new and serious threat. On December 30th, the Finnish 9th Division received operational instructions from the headquarters of the North Finland Group. It was to secure the direction of Lake Kiantajärvi, prevent an enemy advance from the direction of Raate, and after allowing the troops to rest, regroup to defeat the enemy that had advanced along that route. Siilasvuo faced a difficult task. His forces had just fought a hard battle against the 163rd Division. The men were exhausted, while their equipment and supply system had been under constant strain. There was no time, however, for a long rest. The 44th Division on the Raate Road remained a large and dangerous military formation. If it succeeded in resuming its advance westward, the Finns could face another major offensive immediately after the Battle of Suomussalmi. Siilasvuo began moving his forces into position for the new mission. Infantry Regiment 27 assumed a central role. The regiment was deployed in the Suomusjärvi and Kuivasjärvi area south of the Raate Road. It was to advance through difficult forest terrain toward the road and strike the Soviet division's formation from the flank. This clearly illustrates the basic idea behind the Finnish plan. It made little sense for the Finns to attempt to destroy the entire 44th Division in a single direct attack. The Soviet forces had more men and considerably more heavy equipment. Instead, their greatest weakness could be seen on the map. The Raate Road. The men, vehicles, artillery, and supplies of the 44th Division were spread along and around the narrow road. The forests and deep snow made it particularly difficult for heavy equipment to move away from it. The Finns, by contrast, could approach the road through the forests. Skis allowed rapid movement through deep snow. The forest also concealed Finnish troop movements from Soviet observation. Finnish units could therefore attempt to appear unexpectedly on the flanks of the road, strike, and then withdraw back into the forest. Even before the main offensive, the Finns exploited this opportunity. Patrols moved around the Soviet forces, conducted reconnaissance, and carried out harassment attacks. Their purpose was not simply to inflict casualties. They were also gathering information. Where were the enemy's strongest positions? Where were its tanks and artillery located? At which points could the road be cut? And how far did the formation of the 44th Division actually extend? Reconnaissance was crucial, because the Finns were preparing to attack a force that was numerically stronger than their own. The psychological effect was also important. Small Finnish detachments could appear from the forests at different points along the long Soviet column. This made it more difficult for the enemy to determine how many Finns were actually operating in the area and from which direction the main attack would come. At the same time, the temperature continued to fall. The battles on the Raate Road were fought in exceptionally severe winter conditions. The cold placed enormous strain on both sides. Weapons, vehicles, and men had to function at temperatures in which even minor problems with equipment or supplies could become serious. The Finns had the advantage of greater experience in operating under such conditions, but The cold did not spare them either. Finnish soldiers also had to spend long periods outdoors, and later during the battle, some units were forced to spend the night in severe frost with very little tent shelter. On January 1st, 1940, Finnish operations became increasingly active. Infantry Regiment 27 began an attack through the southern end of Lake Kuivasjärvi toward Haukila. The Finns succeeded in reaching the Raate Road. The road was cut at one point, and Finnish forces were also able to bring it under fire elsewhere. This was an important moment. The road used by the 44th Division was no longer a secure line of communication, but the decisive offensive had not yet begun. During the following days, the Finns continued their preparations, reconnoitered the Soviet positions, and regrouped their forces. Siilasvuo's plan began to take its final form. The objective was not to push the 44th Division back toward the border as one unified force. Instead, the long Soviet formation was to be cut at several points. Once communications between its different sections had been severed, one large division would become a collection of smaller, isolated battle groups. In Finnish military history, such encircled enemy formations became known as motis. But drawing up the plan was one thing. Carrying it out was another. The Soviet troops dug in around the road were armed, supported by tanks and artillery, and capable of defending themselves. The Finns would have to move through the dark forests into their attack positions and strike at several points at the same time. The first days of January were spent preparing and fighting. Then Siilasvuo was ready. 8:30. On the morning of January 5, 1940, the main offensive of the Finnish 9th Division began. The decisive Battle of Raate Road had begun. On the morning of January 5, 1940, a severe winter gripped the forests of Kainuu. Around the Raate Road there was snow, darkness, and bitter cold. The Soviet 44th Division deployed along the road had found itself in a situation very different from the kind of battlefield for which a large Red Army division had been designed. There was no continuous Finnish defensive line in front of it. The Finns were in the forests. At 8:30 in the morning, the main offensive of Hjalmar Siilasvuo's 9th Division began. The objective was not simply to capture one road or one enemy position. The objective was to break apart the long formation of the 44th Division. The Finns attacked toward the Raate Road from several directions. Troops advanced through the forests and attempted to reach the road at different points. Once the road was cut, communications between the Soviet units and their ability to move men, ammunition, and heavy equipment along it would be severely disrupted. An important area for the Finnish offensive was around Haukila. There, even before the main offensive, Finnish forces had reached the Raate Road and interfered with Soviet movement. Now the pressure increased. Troops of Infantry Regiment 27 attacked toward the Soviet positions. At the same time, the Finns attempted to create additional roadblocks elsewhere along the road. The fighting was not easy. The soldiers of the 44th Division were not defenseless. The Soviet forces had machine guns, artillery, and tanks. When Finnish troops approached the road across more open ground, they could come under heavy fire. The forest provided cover for movement, but actually reaching the road could still require an assault against enemy positions. The Finns also had to deal with the threat posed by Soviet tanks. In an environment such as the Raate Road, tanks could not exploit their mobility in the same way as on more open terrain, but they remained dangerous firing positions. Their guns and machine guns could dominate the road and its immediate surroundings. The Finns used the anti-tank weapons and close assault methods available to them. During the Winter War, Finnish troops employed weapons including anti-tank guns, satchel charges, and incendiary bottles against enemy tanks. But the outcome of the Battle of Raate Road did not depend on the superiority of any single weapon. What mattered was what happened to the long Soviet formation as a whole. When the Finns reached the road and cut it, sections of the 44th Division began to lose contact with one another. One large formation began to break into smaller groups. The Finns established roadblocks and defensive positions at the points where the road had been cut. Soviet troops, in turn, attempted to reopen their communications and maintain control of the road. The fighting could be extremely intense. Cutting the road did not automatically mean that the Finns would be able to hold the position. Soviet forces could attack the roadblock from both directions. Therefore, once a Finnish detachment succeeded in reaching the road, it had to quickly dig into the snow and ground, organize its defenses, and prepare to repel counterattacks. This created an unusual battlefield around the Raate Road. It was difficult to define a continuous front line. At one point, Finnish troops were north of the road. At another, they were south of it. Elsewhere, a Finnish detachment had cut the road with Soviet forces on both sides. Patrols and small units moving through the forests attempted to identify weak points in the enemy formation and prevent its movement. For the commander of the 44th Division, Alexei Vinogradov, the situation became increasingly difficult. A large division depended on functioning communications. Orders had to move between units. Ammunition had to be delivered forward. The wounded had to be evacuated. Vehicles and artillery had to be able to move. But now the same road upon which the division's advance had depended was becoming its greatest problem. The Finns could strike it from almost anywhere in the surrounding forests. Every new roadblock made the entire formation more difficult to control. Winter affected everything as well. Being forced to remain stationary in the freezing temperatures was dangerous. The men needed warmth and food. Vehicle engines suffered in the cold. The chances of survival for wounded soldiers decreased if they could not be brought rapidly into shelter. The problems of the 44th Division were therefore not limited to Finnish attacks. It was also fighting against the environment itself. Conditions were harsh for the Finns as well, but their methods of operation were better suited to the terrain. Troops moving on skis could use the forests as routes of movement. Smaller detachments were less dependent on the road network, and their movements were more flexible. As January 5th progressed, the Finnish offensive began to produce results. Communications along the Raate Road were cut at several points, and the long formation of the 44th Division began to fragment. But the battle had not yet been decided. There were still thousands of Soviet soldiers. They still possessed heavy weapons, and in many places they defended themselves stubbornly. The Finns now had to begin the next phase. The separated enemy groups had to be isolated from one another. Then Finnish forces could concentrate against them one at a time. Mottes were beginning to form along the Raate Road, and during the following day, the battle would become even more violent. The offensive of January 5th had changed the situation on the Raate Road. The Soviet 44th Division could no longer use the road in the same way as a continuous route for supply and movement. The Finns had penetrated through the forests into gaps within its formation and cut the road at several points, but this was only the first phase. Cutting. The road did not yet mean destroying the enemy. Now the roadblocks had to be held. The different sections of the Soviet forces had to be prevented from reconnecting, and the Finns had to defend their roadblocks while other units continued their attacks toward the road. During the night between January 5th and 6th, the battle continued in freezing temperatures and darkness. The area around the Raate Road became a confused battlefield. In practice, there was no continuous front line. Finnish detachments could be operating in the forests on the flanks and in the rear of Soviet forces. On the road itself were Red Army soldiers, vehicles, artillery, and supply troops attempting to determine which routes were still open. This was exactly the situation the Finns had sought to create. The strength of the 44th Division lay in its size and equipment, but once the formation was divided into smaller sections, it became more difficult to use the strength of the entire division. Tanks in one section of the road could not necessarily assist another. Group artillery communications became more difficult. Supplies could no longer move normally. The transmission of orders became less reliable, and above all, it became increasingly difficult for the divisional commander to form a complete picture of what was happening. The Finns, meanwhile, attempted to exploit their mobility. Units could be moved through the forests from one area of fighting to another. When additional strength was needed at one point, The Finns could attempt to concentrate troops there without having to move along the Raate Road itself. This did not mean, however, that the Finns could move freely. The forests were full of dangers. Soviet patrols also operated away from the road. Artillery and mortars could fire on identified Finnish positions. Machine guns controlled open areas and sections beside the road. Every roadblock had to be fought for and held. One of the most important areas of fighting remained the area around Haukala. There, the formation of the 44th Division had been cut, but Soviet forces defended themselves strongly. The Finnish objective was to expand the roadblocks so that they would not remain merely narrow obstacles. Across the road, they had to become genuine separating zones. If Soviet forces could simply move around a Finnish position through the forest, the value of the roadblock would disappear. The Finns therefore attempted to control the terrain surrounding the road as well. At this stage, the word Mauti, which became closely associated with the Battle of Raate Road, describes the situation well. The word originated in forestry. A Mauti referred to a stack of cut firewood. During the war, it came to describe an enemy force that had been cut off from other units and encircled, or at least isolated as a separate group. A Mauti, however, did not automatically mean a completely sealed ring. In the forests around the Raate Road, an encirclement could be incomplete. It was possible to move through the forests on foot or on skis, and individual soldiers or small groups could sometimes escape. For heavy equipment, the situation was different. A truck, artillery piece, or tank could not simply drive through a forest covered in deep snow. Much of the heavy equipment remained tied to the road. This allowed the Finns to isolate Soviet heavy equipment more effectively than every individual Soviet soldier. During January 6, Finnish pressure continued to increase. Different sections of the 44th Division were forced to fight separately from one another. At some points, Soviet forces attempted to break through Finnish roadblocks. At others, they attempted to organize defensive positions around the road. Some units began attempting to move eastward. The situation became more difficult hour by hour. The effect of the freezing temperatures cannot be separated from the battle, when large numbers of men were forced to remain around the road without adequate shelter. The cold became a constant threat. Lighting fires could reveal a position. Keeping vehicles operational required work, and fuel food supply became increasingly difficult. Treating and evacuating the wounded became more difficult. The Finns suffered from the same conditions, but their supply arrangements and methods of operation were better adapted to the local winter. They could also use routes and support positions concealed within the forests. For the soldiers of the 44th Division, the road was both a lifeline and a trap. The more effectively the Finns cut it, the more difficult it became for the division to operate in an organized manner. Even then, however, this was not yet a complete collapse. The Soviet troops continued to fight. Many of their positions had to be taken by force. The Finns suffered casualties, and their advance could be stopped by determined resistance. But the overall situation was changing rapidly. As January 6 progressed, the possibility that the 44th Division could continue its original mission toward Suomussalmi had effectively disappeared. The question was no longer whether the division could advance westward. The question was whether it could disengage from the Finns and save its men and equipment. The Finnish objective was to prevent exactly that. Siilasvuo's forces continued their attacks. The roadblocks were reinforced, pressure on the Mautis increased, and, for increasing numbers of soldiers of the 44th Division, it was becoming clear that the road to the east was in danger of closing. During the following hours, the battle would enter its decisive phase. The 44th Division had to find a way out, or it would be forced to leave almost all of its heavy equipment behind on the Raate Road. During January 6th, the Battle of Raate Road began to approach its conclusion. Finnish attacks had broken the long formation of the Soviet 44th Division into separate sections. The Raate Road had been cut at several points, and the Finns controlled an increasing amount of the surrounding forest. The original mission of the 44th Division had failed. It was no longer capable of advancing toward Suomussalmi. Now the issue was survival, different. Sections of the division attempted to defend their positions, reopen communications with one another, and find a route back east toward the Soviet border. The Finns attempted to prevent this. Group Fagernes kept the road cut in the Liikkuharju sector. Group Kari operated in the Kokojärvi area, while Infantry Regiment 27 held positions east of Haukala, the area available to the Soviet. Forces between these roadblocks gradually became smaller as the Finns continued their attacks. The basic idea was simple. The road had to remain cut. The terrain between the Mahtis had to be cleared, and the isolated enemy groups had to be pressured until their resistance collapsed. In practice, the task was anything but easy. The Soviet forces had dug into defensive positions, and some still had machine guns, artillery, and tanks available to them. The snow also reduced the effectiveness of Finnish artillery. Deep snow could absorb some of the fragmentation effect of explosions, while soldiers dug into covered positions were difficult targets for indirect fire. For this reason, smaller assault detachments also had to attack the remaining centers of resistance inside the Mahtis. The Mahtis were reduced piece by piece. At the same time, conditions inside them deteriorated. Ammunition was running low. Food was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. Treating the wounded was extremely difficult, and the freezing temperatures continued to wear down both men and equipment. Temperatures around the Raate Road fell extremely low during the battle. Contemporary accounts and Finnish sources describe temperatures reaching approximately -40 degrees Celsius. The cold did not decide the battle by itself, but it made every other problem more serious. A soldier who could not obtain food, warmth, or rest rapidly lost his ability to function. A wounded man could die from exposure even if the wound itself was not immediately fatal. A vehicle whose engine stopped could remain immobilized. For the 44th Division, these problems accumulated while Finnish pressure continued. During January 6th, Soviet resistance in the Haukila area also began to collapse. The situation around Kokojärvi and Tunela became extremely difficult for the Soviet troops. An organized division was becoming a collection of separate battle groups, each of which now had to solve the problem of its own survival. Increasing numbers of Soviet soldiers attempted to leave the road and escape through the forests. This offered a possibility of saving men, but heavy equipment could not be taken with them. The lack of skis made movement through deep snow slow and exhausting. In some cases, small groups entered the forests. In others, larger formations attempted to find routes between the Finnish positions. Movement through the snow, however, left tracks. Finnish patrols could discover these escape routes and follow them. Some Soviet soldiers were killed in the fighting. Some were captured. Others succeeded in reaching their own lines. January 7 became the decisive day in the survival struggle of the 44th Division. Soviet forces still made powerful and organized attempts to break through the Finnish positions. Heavy fighting continued in the Liikkuharju sector. The Finnish roadblocks were severely tested. If the Soviet troops succeeded in reopening the road, at least part of the division, and possibly some of its equipment, could escape eastward in an organized manner. The Finns could not allow the roadblocks to break. The fighting continued. Gradually, however, organized Soviet resistance weakened. The 44th Division was no longer able to restore unified command or reopen the Raate Road in a controlled manner. By this stage, much of its heavy equipment had effectively been lost. The road was filled with trucks, artillery pieces, tractors, field kitchens, armored vehicles, ammunition, and other military material. Some of the equipment had been destroyed in combat. Some had been damaged. Some had simply been abandoned. When the soldiers attempted to escape eastward through the forests, this was the final catastrophe of the 44th Division. Only a few days earlier, approximately 14,000 men of a Soviet division had occupied the Raate Road together with heavy weapons and an enormous supply column. Now its organized battle formation had disintegrated. But this does not mean that the entire division was destroyed to the last. Man, this is important. Later legend has sometimes created the impression that almost every Soviet soldier who arrived on the Raate Road was killed. That did not happen. Thousands of men survived and succeeded in returning to the Soviet side. The losses were nevertheless severe, and above all, the 44th Division lost an enormous amount of its equipment. After January 7th, the nature of the fighting changed. The major organized Soviet attacks were largely over. The Finns continued clearing the area, searching for enemy groups scattered through the forests, taking prisoners and collecting captured equipment. The Raate Road was left with a scene that would become one of the most famous symbols of the entire Winter War. 4 kilometers along the snow-covered road were abandoned and destroyed vehicles, weapons, equipment, and other military material. But there were also dead men and horses. The battle had effectively been decided. The Finns had stopped the 44th Division and broken apart its organized battle formation. But the next question was what the victory had actually cost. How many men had been killed? How many had been wounded? How many Soviet soldiers had escaped? And how much military equipment had been left behind on the Raate Road? It was around these numbers that some of the greatest myths of the Battle of Raate Road would later develop. The cost of victory in the army left on the Raate Road. After January 7th, the battlefield along the Raate Road began to grow quieter. Organized Soviet resistance had largely collapsed. Finnish troops continued clearing the area and searching for Soviet soldiers who had scattered into the forests. Later research by the Finnish National Defense University has described January 7th as the culmination point of the 44th Division's struggle for survival. After that, operations consisted mainly of clearing the battlefield. When the fighting ended, the full scale of what had happened along the Raate Road became visible to the Finns, and an enormous quantity of abandoned Soviet equipment surrounded the snow-covered forest. Road trucks, artillery, pieces, tanks and armored cars, tractors, field, kitchens, horses, ammunition, rifles, machine guns, and other military equipment. Some had been destroyed during the fighting, had broken down or become immobilized, but a considerable amount had simply been abandoned when Soviet soldiers were forced to leave the road and attempt to escape eastward through the forests on foot. For the Finns, the captured equipment was extremely valuable. At the beginning of the Winter War, the Finnish army suffered from shortages of many kinds of military equipment. Usable enemy weapons, vehicles, and other supplies were therefore recovered whenever possible. The reported quantities of equipment captured on the Raate Road vary somewhat depending on the source. Well-known Finnish accounts have listed, among other things, 43 tanks, approximately 100 artillery pieces, large numbers of armored vehicles and trucks, and more than 1,100 horses. Vast quantities of small arms, ammunition, and other material were also captured. The road also became one of the most photographed battlefields of the Winter War. Images of vehicles, artillery pieces, and tanks standing abandoned in the snow created a powerful visual representation of the Finnish victory. These photographs helped build the legend of the Raate Road, but among the equipment was another sight. Dead soldiers. The exact losses suffered by the 44th Division remain one of the most difficult questions in the history of the Battle of Raate Road. During the war and for many years afterward, extremely high figures were presented in Finland. Some older estimates claimed that approximately 17,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed in the Battle of Raate Road alone. There is an obvious problem with this figure. According to current research, the 44th Division had only approximately 14,000 men at the beginning of January. Therefore, old claims of more than 17,000 dead cannot simply be reconciled with the actual strength of the division. Later, Finnish estimates have also suggested approximately 7,000 to 9,000 Soviet dead, but as research has developed, these figures have also been questioned. Part of the problem is that the battles of Suomussalmi and the Raate Road have often merged into a single event in later memory. Two major Soviet divisions fought in the region. The 163rd Division suffered heavy losses in the battles around Suomussalmi before the final defeat of the 44th Division on the Raate Road. When casualties, missing soldiers, and later estimates from these different battles were combined, the figures could easily grow beyond reality. Furthermore, not every soldier of the 44th Division was killed or captured. This is one of the most important misconceptions surrounding the Battle of Raate Road. When the division's organization collapsed, large numbers of Soviet soldiers abandoned their heavy equipment and withdrew eastward through the forests. Some succeeded in reaching Soviet territory. The division was therefore destroyed primarily as an effective military formation. It lost its mission, its coherent organization, and a large part of its equipment. That does not mean that every one of its soldiers was destroyed. The Finns also paid a price for the victory. Figures for Finnish casualties on the Raate Road vary somewhat, depending on the source and how the battle is defined. Common Finnish accounts give approximately 400 men killed or missing. This was far smaller than the losses suffered by the enemy, but for a small army such as Finland's, every lost soldier mattered. The victory on the Raate Road was also not achieved without serious mistakes, failed attacks, or difficult individual battles. Later legend can easily reduce the events to a simple story. The Finns skied through the forests, cut the road, and destroyed a helpless enemy. The actual battle was much harder. Soviet troops launched counterattacks. Finnish roadblocks were at times in danger of being broken. Strongly defended positions had to be captured in close combat. Finnish soldiers also had to spend nights in temperatures approaching -40°C, and on January 5th, the troops had only limited tent shelter available. The true significance of the victory on the Raate Road does not require exaggerated numbers. Soviet division of approximately 14,000 men had been stopped. Its mission to assist the 163rd Division at Suomussalmi had failed. Its organized battle formation had been broken. A large quantity of its heavy equipment had fallen into Finnish hands, and the Finns had removed a serious threat in the Suomussalmi sector. The fighting on the Raate Road is generally considered to have ended by January 8th, and within a few more days, no significant organized Soviet force remained in the Suomussalmi area. But the consequences of the battle did not end there. In the Soviet Union, the question remained of how an entire division had ended in catastrophe. Responsibility fell particularly heavily on its leadership. The commander of the 44th Division, Alexei Vinogradov, had survived and reached the Soviet side. His fate, however, would be grim. The fate of the 44th Division's commanders. The Battle of Raate Road had ended in catastrophe for the Soviet 44th Division. The division had failed in its original mission to assist the 163rd Division fighting at Suomussalmi. Its advance had been stopped, its battle formation had disintegrated, and a large quantity of its equipment had fallen into Finnish hands. But the commander of the 44th Division, Alexei Vinogradov, had survived. He succeeded in reaching the Soviet side together with some of his troops. Surviving the battlefield, however, did not mean that the danger was over. The Soviet military leadership wanted to determine why the division had suffered such a severe defeat. Responsibility quickly focused on its commanders. When assessing Vinogradov's actions, it is important to understand the difficult situation in which the 44th Division had found itself. The division had been ordered to advance along the Raate Road toward Suomussalmi to assist the 163rd Division. But the situation of the 163rd Division had already collapsed before the 44th Division could decide the battle. Vinogradov's division then became the target of the Finnish offensive. The Finns cut the Raate Road at several points. Different sections of the division lost contact with one another. Supply became increasingly difficult, and eventually, an organized withdrawal turned into a fragmented escape toward the east. From the Soviet perspective, someone had to be held responsible for such a catastrophe. Vinogradov was not the only commander to face charges. Together with him, the division's chief of staff, Colonel Onufry Volkov, and the head of its political department, Regimental Commissar J.I. Pakomov, were also held responsible. Their fate was decided quickly. The case was heard by a military tribunal. The divisional leadership was accused, among other things, of losing control of its troops and abandoning large quantities of weapons and other military equipment on the battlefield. Vinogradov, Volkov, and Pakomov were sentenced to death. On January 11, 1940, they were executed by firing squad. The executions took place only a few days after the Battle of Raate Road had ended. The episode later became one of the best-known aftermath stories associated with the battle. It is often simplified into the claim that Stalin personally ordered the unsuccessful divisional commander to be shot. The reality was formally more complex. The commanders were brought before a military tribunal and sentenced through the Soviet military justice system. That does not mean that the proceedings corresponded to a modern concept of independent justice. Within the Soviet military system of the Stalin era, failure could result in extremely severe punishment. The defeat on the Raate Road was also militarily and politically humiliating. Finland's small army had stopped and broken apart a major Red Army formation. Photographs of Soviet equipment abandoned along the Raate Road also circulated outside Finland. They were powerful propaganda. They provided visible evidence that the Red Army was not invincible. For the Soviet Union, the problem was greater than the defeat of a single division. The opening weeks of the Winter War had revealed serious weaknesses in Red Army command, training, communications, and its ability to operate in difficult terrain. Dr. Suomussalmi and the Raate Road were particularly visible examples of these problems. But it would be too simple to explain the defeat of the 44th Division solely as a failure of its commanders. The division had entered an extremely unfavorable operational situation. Its movement and supply depended heavily on a single road. The Finns could move through the forests along its flanks. The 163rd Division, which the 44th Division had been sent to assist, had already been forced to withdraw. The winter conditions were extremely severe, and the Finns were able to concentrate their forces against the Raate Road after the decisive phase of the Battle of Suomussalmi had ended. Vinogradov therefore faced genuine and serious problems. At the same time, mistakes were made in the leadership of the division. Deploying the troops along a long road corridor made the formation vulnerable. Once the Finns cut the road, cooperation between different parts of the division rapidly became more difficult. Situational awareness deteriorated, and when the withdrawal finally began, it was no longer possible to save the enormous quantity of equipment. The execution of 3 commanders, however, could neither restore the lost division nor eliminate the structural problems that the Winter War had exposed within the Red Army. The Soviet Union was forced to change its methods during the war. Command was improved. Forces were concentrated more heavily on the most important fronts. Artillery was employed more systematically, and the Red Army began to take Finnish defenses more seriously than it had during the opening weeks of the war. This would have major consequences during the later stages of the winter war on the Karelian Isthmus. The victory on the Raate Road was therefore an enormous Finnish success. But it did not decide the war. The Soviet Union possessed vast military resources. Finland still had to continue fighting. The significance of the Raate Road was different. It demonstrated what a smaller force could achieve when it effectively exploited terrain, mobility, reconnaissance, and local superiority. At the same time, the battle demonstrated how vulnerable a large military formation could become when its movement and supply were tied to a single narrow road. The executions of the commanders of the 44th Division closed one chapter of the story of the Raate Road. But the legend of the battle itself was only beginning. Why did the Finns win on the Raate Road? The Battle of Raate Road became one of the most famous Finnish victories of the Winter War. But why did the Finns win? The simplest explanation often goes like this. The Finns understood winter warfare, moved on skis and used Mati tactics, while the Soviet forces became trapped on a narrow road. There is some truth in this description, but the real explanation is much more complex. The first decisive factor was the terrain. The Raate Road ran as a long, narrow route through forests, marshes, and lakes. Much of the heavy equipment of the 44th Division depended on this road. Trucks, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles could not move freely through forests covered in deep snow. This made the large Soviet division dangerous, but at the same time rigid. The Finns had a very different ability to use the terrain. Infantry. Moving on, skis could travel through forests where vehicles had practically no possibility of advancing. This allowed Finnish troops to bypass Soviet positions and appear on the Raate Road at points where the enemy did not necessarily expect a major attack. For the Finns, the forest was a route of movement. For the 44th Division, the road was a lifeline. The difference was enormous. The second important factor was Finnish reconnaissance. Before the decisive offensive, Finnish patrols operated around the Soviet forces. Their task was to determine the enemy's location, strength, defensive positions, and movements. This helped Siilasvuo's command develop an understanding of where the formation of the 44th Division was most vulnerable. When the offensive began, the Finns were therefore not attacking a completely unknown enemy. They had information about what was waiting on the other side of the forest. The third decisive factor was concentration of force. When the Battle of Raate Road is viewed as a whole, the Finns were the smaller force. But at individual points on the battlefield, the situation could be reversed. Because the 44th Division was stretched along a long road, its full strength could not be used in one place. The Finns, by contrast, could concentrate troops against a particular section of the road. In this way, a force that was inferior overall could create local situations in which it had enough strength to make an attack succeed. This was the real logic behind Modi warfare. First, the enemy was divided into separate sections. Then, those sections were prevented from effectively supporting one another. Finally, Finnish forces could concentrate against one isolated group at a time. A Mati was therefore not some single secret Finnish military trick. It resulted from combining mobility, terrain, reconnaissance, and concentration of force. The fourth factor was leadership. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo had to make decisions in a rapidly changing situation. His troops had just fought against the 163rd Division at Suomussalmi. Yet almost immediately, they had to begin another operation against the 44th Division. Finnish command also allowed a considerable degree of initiative to lower-level leaders. In an environment such as the Raate Road, this was important. A company, platoon, or small assault detachment commander fighting in the forests could not always wait for detailed instructions from higher headquarters. Situations changed rapidly. The road might be cut at one location and then reopened moments later by a Soviet counterattack. Action had to be taken. Later analysis by the Finnish National Defense University identifies this constant activity as one of the key characteristics of Finnish operations on the Raate Road. If a Soviet counterattack reopened the road and forced the Finns back into the forest, the attack did not necessarily end. The troops reorganized. Then they tried again. This continuous activity wore down the enemy and prevented it from receiving a long period of relief. The fifth factor was logistics. It is easily overshadowed by the famous ski attacks and Matis. But without functioning logistics, the Finnish operation could not have continued. Food had to reach the troops. Ammunition had to be brought forward. The wounded had to be evacuated from the battlefield. The men needed opportunities to warm themselves and rest. Horses also played an important role in the Finnish supply system. The logistics of the 9th Division were organized mainly from the directions of Finland and Suomussalmi, and as the fighting progressed, the system was moved to support the troops from closer positions. Research conducted at the Finnish National Defense University has found that during the Raate Road operation, Finnish supply distances were relatively favorable, allowing logistics to react to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The situation of the 44th Division was the opposite. Its logistics depended on the same road that the Finns were constantly attempting to cut. When the road was severed, the problem affected much more than the combat troops. Ammunition could no longer move normally. Food could not be delivered normally. Evacuating the wounded became more difficult. Transporting fuel and other material became more difficult. Every Finnish roadblock therefore affected an area much larger than the immediate point where the road had been cut. The sixth factor was winter. But this requires careful explanation. It is often said that the Finns won because they could endure the cold while the Soviet soldiers could not. It was not that simple. The freezing temperatures killed and injured Finns as well. Finnish troops also suffered from cold, exhaustion, and inadequate shelter. The difference was primarily in how effectively the forces could operate in such an environment. The Finns were more accustomed to skiing, moving through forests, and incorporating winter conditions into their operations. Their clothing, methods of movement, and logistics were better suited to the local environment. For the 44th Division, the same environment amplified problems that already existed. If supplies were cut, the cold made the situation worse. If a vehicle broke down, repairing it in freezing temperatures became more difficult. If a soldier was wounded and could not be evacuated, the cold reduced his chances of survival. Winter therefore did not win the battle for the Finns by itself. The Finns were simply better able to use winter as part of their way of fighting. In the end, the outcome of the Battle of Raate Road resulted from a combination of factors: terrain, mobility, reconnaissance, leadership, logistics, concentration of force, continuous activity, and the enemy's dependence on a single, narrow road. The Finnish National Defense University has used the Battle of Raate Road as an example of how a numerically inferior force that understands its environment and exploits it effectively can defeat a militarily stronger opponent. That may be the most important lesson of the entire battle. The Finns did not win because they had more men. They did not win because they had more tanks. They did not win because their artillery was overwhelmingly superior. They won because they were able to use the resources available to them more effectively than their opponent in that particular environment. The strengths of the 44th Division were turned into weaknesses. Its large number of vehicles tied it to the road. Its long column offered numerous points where it could be attacked. Its size made command more difficult once communications were disrupted. And when the division was broken into smaller sections, much of the significance of its overall superiority disappeared. The Raate Road was a great Finnish victory, but above all, it was a victory in the use of terrain, forces, and time. That is why it continues to be studied. And that is why a narrow forest road in Kainuu became one of the most famous battlefields of the entire Winter War. The significance of the victory on the Raate Road. When the fighting on the Raate Road ended during the first week of January 1940, the Finns had achieved one of the most striking victories of the Winter War. Militarily, the result was clear. The Soviet 44th Division had failed in its attempt to advance toward Suomussalmi. The division had been broken apart, a large quantity of its equipment had been lost, and its combat effectiveness had been severely damaged. At the same time, the immediate Soviet threat in the Suomussalmi sector had been defeated. This mattered. On a much larger scale, the Soviet offensive in northern Finland aimed to advance into the Finnish interior and disrupt important lines of communication. The road network leading westward through Suomussalmi offered a route for an advance toward the direction of Oulu. In later accounts, this objective has often been summarized by the claim that the Red Army intended to cut Finland in two by advancing directly to Oulu. This idea reflects a genuine strategic threat, but it should not be presented too simplistically as a single, certain operational plan. What is clear is that a successful Soviet advance westward through Suomussalmi would have been extremely dangerous for Finland. The road and railway connections of northern Finland were important to the country's defense, Particularly significant were Finland's connections toward the Swedish border and the ports of the Gulf of Bothnia, through which Finland could maintain links with the outside world. The victories at Suomussalmi and the Raate Road prevented the Soviet forces from advancing along this route. They also allowed the Finns to release troops for other tasks. But the significance of the Raate Road was not only strategic, its psychological impact was enormous. When the Winter War began on November 30th, 1939, the balance of power looked grim for Finland. The Soviet Union possessed a vastly larger population, industrial capacity, and armed forces. Many foreign observers doubted how long Finland could resist the invasion. Then reports began to emerge from Suomussalmi. A small Finnish army had stopped major Red Army formations in the middle of winter, and photographs from the Raate Road made the events tangible. Abandoned Soviet trucks stood along the snow-covered road. Artillery pieces, tanks, field kitchens, ammunition, horses, and other military equipment. Finnish soldiers stood among an enormous quantity of captured material. These photographs had great propaganda value. They demonstrated that the Red Army could be defeated. For Finland, this was important. The country needed international sympathy, material assistance, and political support. The Winter War had generated powerful reactions around the world, and the Finns actively sought to communicate their struggle to foreign audiences. Victories, such as the Raate Road, reinforced the image of a small state successfully defending itself against a much larger aggressor. At the same time, however, a legend began to emerge. Finnish soldiers were often portrayed as almost supernatural winter warriors. Ski troops dressed in white appeared from the forests, struck the enemy, and disappeared back into the darkness. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, could easily be portrayed as a passive mass waiting to be destroyed beside the road. Reality was more complicated. The soldiers of the 44th Division launched counterattacks. They defended their positions. They attempted to reopen the road, and thousands eventually succeeded in withdrawing back to the Soviet side. The Finnish victory was remarkable precisely because the opponent was not completely helpless. For the Soviet Union, the events at Suomussalmi and the Raate Road were also an important warning. The opening phase of the Winter War had revealed serious problems within the Red Army. Commanding large formations was difficult. Communications did not always function effectively. Units could become too dependent on the road network. Reconnaissance was inadequate, and the effects of Finnish terrain and winter conditions had been underestimated. The Raate Road exposed these problems with exceptional severity. But the Soviet Union did not continue fighting the entire Winter War in the same way. It learned. As the winter progressed, Red Army operations changed. On the Karelian Isthmus in particular, the Soviet Union concentrated enormous quantities of artillery, troops, and equipment against Finnish defensive positions in February 1940. The attacks were prepared more systematically than before. For the Finns, this meant that the victory on the Raate Road did not remove the fundamental problem of the war. Finland was still fighting a much larger state. On the Raate Road, the Finns had succeeded in creating a local situation in which the enemy could not effectively use its overall superiority. On the more open and densely occupied battlefields of the Karelian Isthmus, creating the same kind of situation was far more difficult. The victory on the Raate Road should therefore not be seen as evidence that Finland was close to winning. The entire war militarily, it was a major operational victory within one important sector of the front, and as such, it was an exceptional achievement. The Battle of Raate Road also demonstrated something that has remained relevant to military history ever since. Military power is not determined only by the number of soldiers, tanks, or artillery pieces an army possesses. What also matters is whether an army can use those resources effectively in the environment in which it has to fight. On the Raate Road, the 44th Division possessed a considerable number of men and heavy weapons, but much of that power was tied to a single narrow road. The Finns found a way to attack precisely that: dependence. This made the Raate Road more than simply one battle of the Winter War. It became an example of how terrain, mobility, leadership, and the local concentration of force can alter the course of an apparently unequal battle. In Finland, the Raate Road quickly became part of the national memory of the war. Its name became associated with determination, winter warfare, and turning a seemingly impossible situation into victory. But over the decades, numbers and details were also added to the story that do not always withstand historical examination. How great was the numerical superiority in reality? How many Soviet soldiers were actually killed? Was the 44th Division truly completely destroyed? And was the famous Matti tactic really as simple and perfect as later legend suggests? The real history of the Raate Road is at least as remarkable as the legend. Next, we will separate the two: myth and reality on the Raate Road. The Battle of Raate Road became a legend almost immediately. The image was powerful. A small Finnish force confronted a massive Red Army division in the forests of Kainuu. The Finns moved on skis. The Soviet forces were tied to a narrow road. At its worst, the temperature approached -40 degrees Celsius, and only a few days later, the road was filled with abandoned vehicles, artillery pieces, tanks, equipment, and dead soldiers. Everything required for the creation of a great military legend was there. But during the following decades, claims also became attached to the real events of the Raate Road that later research has had to reconsider. The first major question concerns the number of troops. Older Finnish literature and popular accounts have often given the strength of the 44th Division as approximately 20,000 or even 25,000 men. This creates an extraordinarily dramatic story: approximately 6,000 Finns against 25,000 Soviet soldiers. But more recent research presents a different picture. At the beginning of January 1940, the strength of the 44th Division was approximately 14,000 men. Some studies, based on Soviet material, give the precise figure of 13,962. The Finns had approximately 6,000 men in the Raate Road operation. The Finns were therefore still clearly outnumbered, but they were not facing a division of 25,000 men. This correction does not diminish the significance of the Finnish victory. Quite the opposite. The historical event is extraordinary enough without increasing the numbers. The second major myth concerns Soviet casualties. Over the decades, enormous figures have been associated with the Raate Road. Some accounts have claimed that as many as 17,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. If the actual strength of the 44th Division was approximately 14,000 men, such a figure obviously cannot represent only the soldiers of that division killed on the Raate Road. Later, an estimate of approximately 7,000 to 9,000 Soviet dead became widely used. But this figure must also be treated cautiously. No complete and undisputed casualty figure has been established. The problem is made more difficult by the fact that the battles of Suomussalmi and the Raate Road are often combined. The 163rd Division had already suffered its own heavy losses before the final defeat of the 44th Division. If casualty figures from different battles are combined, or if the boundaries between those battles are unclear, enormous totals can easily result. What is certain is that the 44th Division suffered heavy losses. Large numbers of men were killed. Others went missing. Soldiers were taken prisoner, and thousands were forced to abandon their equipment and attempt to reach the Soviet border through the forests on foot. This brings us to the third myth. It is often said that the Finns destroyed the 44th Division. In a military sense, this is a reasonable description. The division ceased to function as a coherent and effective fighting formation. Its mission failed. Its communications were severed. Its units became fragmented, and a large quantity of its equipment was lost. But if the word destroyed is understood to mean that almost every soldier in the division was killed, the claim is false. Thousands of Soviet soldiers survived. When organized resistance collapsed, men withdrew eastward through the forests. Heavy equipment, however, could not be moved through deep snow in the same way. The road was therefore left filled with vehicles and weapons, even though some of the men who had operated them succeeded in escaping. The fourth myth concerns the cold. The Battle of Raate Road was fought in exceptionally severe winter conditions. During the night of January 5th, Finnish sources report temperatures of approximately -40 degrees Celsius. The cold was a real and dangerous enemy. But the Finnish victory is sometimes explained almost entirely by the claim that the Soviet soldiers simply froze to death. That does not give an accurate picture either. The freezing temperatures affected both sides. Finnish soldiers also had to sleep outdoors and suffered from the cold. The difference was in how effectively the forces were able to operate under winter conditions. The Finns were better prepared to ski, move through forests, and maintain their effectiveness in the cold. For the Soviet forces, the freezing temperatures intensified problems that already existed. When supply lines were cut, obtaining food and warm shelter became more difficult. When a vehicle stopped, keeping it operational became more difficult. When a soldier was wounded, exposure made his situation even more dangerous. The cold was therefore an important factor, but it did not fight the battle for the Finns. The fifth simplification concerns Maadi tactics. In hindsight, the events on the Raate Road can appear almost like a perfect plan. The Finns ski through the forest. The road is cut. The enemy is divided into Maadis, and the Maadis are destroyed one by one. The real battle was much more confused. Soviet forces launched counterattacks. Some Finnish attacks failed. Roadblocks had to be defended. Lost positions had to be recaptured, and some Soviet positions were extremely difficult to break. Later tactical analysis by the Finnish National Defense University emphasizes that the opening of the Finnish offensive did not cause an immediate Soviet collapse. The Soviet troops did not simply flee because they had been surprised. The most important Finnish achievement was gaining the initiative and then refusing to surrender it. The 44th Division was forced to react. The Finns continued to act. When an attack failed at one point, they tried again. When the road was cut, they attempted to keep it cut. When the enemy had been separated into sections, they attempted to prevent those sections from supporting one another. This continuous pressure was essential. The sixth myth concerns the Soviet soldiers themselves. In the legend of the Raate Road, they easily became a faceless enemy mass. In reality, they were individual human beings. A large part of the personnel of the 44th Division came from the Ukrainian region. They did not personally decide to invade Finland. They were Red Army soldiers who had been ordered north to fight in an environment for which many of them were poorly prepared. Many died thousands of kilometers from their homes. Others were wounded. Some became Finnish prisoners of war, and some survived the journey back to the Soviet Union only to face questions about why their division had been defeated. There were real people behind the legend on the Finnish side as well. The approximately 6,000 Finnish soldiers were not a force of fearless, mythical winter warriors. They were exhausted men, many of whom had already been fighting for weeks. They were cold. They were afraid. They made mistakes, and they suffered casualties, yet they continued to operate. That is precisely why the real history of the Raate Road is so remarkable. The victory does not need to be explained by supernatural determination. It does not need to be enlarged by invented enemy numbers, and the Soviet soldiers do not need to have been incompetent for the Finnish achievement to remain significant. Reality is enough. A force of approximately 6,000 Finns succeeded in stopping a Soviet division of approximately 14,000 men under extremely difficult winter conditions. The Finns exploited the terrain, mobility provided by skis, reconnaissance, leadership, and the enemy's dependence on a single road. They seized the initiative, they kept it, and ultimately, the 44th Division lost its ability to carry out the mission it had been given. That was the real victory on the Raate Road. And when the myths surrounding it are removed, the achievement does not become smaller. It becomes easier to understand. The legacy of the Raate Road decades have passed since the Battle of Raate Road. The forest has grown. The sound of artillery has disappeared. The vehicles and weapons have been removed. But the name of the Raate Road has not disappeared from Finnish history. It became one of the most famous battlefields of the Winter War and, at the same time, a symbol of a much larger story. During the Winter War, Finland fought the Soviet Union in a situation where the military resources of the two countries were very different. On the Raate Road, this imbalance could be seen clearly. The Finns did not possess the same numbers of men, tanks, vehicles, or other heavy equipment as the Red Army. Yet the Finns succeeded in stopping the 44th Division and rendering it ineffective as a fighting formation. That is why the Raate Road quickly became more than simply a military victory. It became a story of how a smaller force could use its environment in a way that changed the balance of power. The Finns used the forests for movement. Skis allowed them to advance through areas where heavy vehicles could not operate. Reconnaissance helped identify vulnerable points in the enemy formation. Roadblocks divided the long Soviet formation into separate sections, and continuous offensive action prevented the 44th Division from regaining control of the situation. These factors have also made the Raate Road interesting from the perspective of military history and the study of warfare. The battle can be examined as an example of how terrain and mobility affect the actual use of military power. A force that is larger on paper is not necessarily stronger at every point on the battlefield. If its units cannot support one another, the significance of its overall superiority is reduced. That is exactly what happened on the Raate Road. The long formation of the 44th Division was stretched along a narrow road connection. When the Finns succeeded in cutting that connection at several points, cooperation between the different sections of the division became increasingly difficult. The Finns, meanwhile, could concentrate their forces at selected locations. This is one reason why the events of the Raate Road have remained an example of winter warfare and of what a numerically inferior force can achieve. But there is another side to the legacy of the Raate Road. The battle became a legend, and the legend began to develop a life of its own. Over the years, the strength of the Soviet forces became larger than reality in some accounts. The number of dead increased. Mahti tactics came to be portrayed almost as a perfect Finnish masterpiece of warfare in which everything happened according to a predetermined plan. The real battle was far more chaotic. The Finns made mistakes, attacks failed, roadblocks were lost and recaptured. Soviet forces defended themselves and launched counterattacks, and thousands of soldiers of the 44th Division survived. The purpose of historical research is not to diminish the significance of the Finnish victory on the Raate Road. Its purpose is to separate the actual events from the stories that developed later. When this is done, the achievement on the Raate Road does not become less impressive. Quite the opposite. In reality, the Finns had to carry out a difficult operation under extremely severe conditions against an opponent possessing a considerable number of men and heavy weapons. Victory did not come automatically. It had to be achieved. The legacy of the Raate Road can also be seen in the location itself. Today, the Raate Road is a historical memorial landscape. Sites connected with the events of the Winter War, memorials, and former battle locations can be found in the area. Near the Raate Gate stands the Winter War Monument, commemorating those who died in the battles of Suomussalmi. Its field consists of thousands of stones, symbolizing those who lost their lives in the fighting. The wind moves bells incorporated into the monument. The idea is powerful. When the sound of weapons has ended, remembrance remains. The history of the Raate Road does not belong only to the Finns. Large numbers of Red Army soldiers also died along the road. Many of the men of the 44th Division came from Ukraine. They had been sent far from their homes to fight in the forests of Kainuu during an exceptionally cold winter. The military outcome can be examined in terms of victory and defeat. From a human perspective, the battlefield was a tragedy for both sides. Young men froze. They were wounded, they were killed, or they disappeared into the forests. Many Finns never returned home either. Remembering this is important because later legends can easily turn war into numbers. How many men? How many tanks? How many artillery pieces? How many dead? But behind every number was a human being. The historical significance of the Raate Road therefore comes from two parallel realities. It was an exceptional Finnish military victory, and at the same time, it was an extremely costly battle in which thousands of people experienced the harshest reality of war. The Winter War continued for more than 2 months after the events on the Raate Road. The Finnish army could not stop the Soviet Union everywhere in the same way it had at Suomussalmi. In February 1940, the Red Army broke through Finnish defensive positions on the Karelian Isthmus. Finland's resources were being exhausted. On March 13, 1940, the fighting ended when the Moscow Peace Treaty came into effect. Finland retained its independence, but was forced to cede extensive territories to the Soviet Union. The victory on the Raate Road therefore did not decide the Winter War. It did not remove Finland's enormous strategic problem, but it resolved one extremely dangerous situation at a moment when Finland had very little room for failure. And that is the true historical significance of the Raate Road. For a brief moment, a narrow road through the forests of Kainuu became a place where the balance of power in a much larger war was turned upside down. The Finns exploited what they had available: terrain, mobility, local knowledge, leadership, and the ability to continue attacking despite difficulties. In January 1940, the Raate Road became a battlefield. Afterward, it became a legend. Today, our task is to see both. The legend explains why the Raate Road is remembered. History explains what actually happened there. Raate Road, a legend of the Winter War in January 1940. The Raate Road was nothing more than a narrow, snow-covered road through the forests of Kainuu. Within a matter of days, it became one of the most famous battlefields in Finnish military history. There, Finnish soldiers faced a larger enemy in a situation where there was very little room for failure. The outcome was not decided by superior weapons or greater numbers. It was decided by the use of terrain, mobility, reconnaissance, leadership, functioning logistics, and the ability to maintain the initiative. The advance of the Soviet 44th Division was stopped. Its formation was broken apart. A large quantity of its equipment was left behind on the Raate Road. But behind the victory was also the suffering of thousands of people, Finns and Soviets, the dead, the wounded, and those who carried the memory of the battle with them for the rest of their lives. Over the decades, a legend developed around the Raate Road. Some numbers grew. Some events became simplified. But the real history does not need exaggeration. The success of approximately 6,000 Finns against a Soviet division of approximately 14,000 men was already an exceptional military achievement. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Raate Road, however, cannot be found in the numbers. It can be found in what happens when an army understands its environment better than its opponent, when a larger force cannot use its full strength, and when a smaller force finds a way to seize the initiative and refuse to surrender it. Today, the Raate Road is quiet. The forests have reclaimed the landscape, but the events of January 1940 have not disappeared. The road is still there. The memorials are still there. And as long as these events continue to be studied and remembered, the stories of the men who fought there will survive as, well, this was the Battle of Raate Road, one of the most famous Finnish victories of the Winter War, and one of the best-known battles of winter warfare in the frozen North. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me which historical battle or person you would like to see covered next. Thank you for watching.